This is Glow in the Dark Radio. The science fiction podcast, with original independent science fiction, written and performed by Mike Luoma, with music by Kevin MacLeod. The Vatican Assassin Trilogy and The Adventures of Alibi Jones by Mike Luoma are available in ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook wherever you find your books online. Get links and details at glowinthedarkradio.com. This is the Science Fiction Podcast, Glow in the Dark Radio. I'm your host, your writer and reader, Mike Luoma, and I have part 1 of Chapter 14 of Vatican Abdicator coming up on this episode. BC is in Vatican City to meet with Mbeke, who is now officially the new Pope, John Paul IV. He took over, of course, when BC abdicated, so now they've made it official. BC has him trying to create a unified holy book, along with the Caliph and the representatives of the universal Islamic nation. This would be a unified holy book featuring both Islam and Christianity. But that's not really going so well. BC thought it might help explain human religion and belief to alien races, if we could give them something like this, but it's not really happening so far, so we'll see. Maybe not. BC will get a report on that and more as we get into Chapter 14 of Vatican Abdicator coming up on Glow in the Dark Radio. Huge thank you to my patrons, because you keep this thing going. Without you, I couldn't do this. And so I got to thank you big time for helping me to keep the podcast going and keep the websites up and keep bringing stories to people. Like Vatican Abdicator, Chapter 14, Part 1. It's on the way. If you want to become a patron and help support my efforts, I would love to have you on board. We have a $2 level, $2 a month, $5 a month, and a $10 a month level for whatever you feel like doing. Just head to patreon.com/glowinthedarkradio to become a patron. Or go to, of course, glowinthedarkradio.com or mikeluoma.com and follow the links to Patreon to become a patron or just to learn more. Patrons help me do what I do. Couldn't do it without you. Thank you. Also want to remind you that you can get a free audiobook. For a limited time, I am giving away the Vatican Assassin 15th Anniversary Edition audiobook. That's the one with the very cool voice cameos from Keith Hughes, John Miro, Dave Robison, Starla Hutchton, Veronica Giguere, Paul E. Cooley, and Scott Sigler. All pitching in and helping me out to do a very cool version of Vatican Assassin for its 15th anniversary. So that is out there now as a free audiobook at every site except for Audible. They just aren't playing nice, so you can get it free in many other places. Just look for Vatican Assassin, the 15th Anniversary Edition audiobook. And you can follow the link in the show notes if you want direct links to some of the places that have that free audiobook. That's all for our book news. Up next, we'll get into part 1 of Chapter 14 of Vatican Abdicator on Glow in the Dark Radio.
The Flesh Pulp Podcast. 3 to 10 minutes of fiction brought to you thrice weekly. 200 miles below the surface of the earth, at the terminus of a series of long-sealed caverns and interconnected shrines, under the shadow of the eternally bleeding eye, there is a crippled wreck of a man writing tales, stories of a dimension engulfed in madness. He is writing them of you. Think them all at fleshpulp.com or search for it on iTunes.
Now here's Vatican Abdicator, Chapter 14, Part 1, on Glow in the Dark Radio. BC and Mbeke finally meet on Leap Day, February 29th, in Mbeke's offices in Vatican City. BC can tell by the expression on the Pope's face as he meets Mbeke that whatever news there is, it isn't good news. "We can't do it," Mbeke says as they settle into chairs in Mbeke's offices. "What do you mean? You can't do what?" "We cannot reconcile these two very different religions, BC. Not even for a book. There's no way. My people have been sitting at the table with the people sent by the Caliph. We've gone over the Quran and the Bible, but there's no common ground. They say the Quran has to be in Arabic, its original tongue. How do you compromise on that? And they look down at our many translations." "So they won't budge on that?" BC asks. "No, not at all. Even the more liberal among them hold on to that as an essential element of their faith." "How about we print it side by side, Arabic and whatever language the book is in?" "In columns? I don't know if that will work for them." "What about page by page?" BC asks. He grabs a book off a nearby shelf. "I used to have an old book of poetry by a German poet, Rainer Maria Rilke. The English translation was on the odd-numbered pages, the original German version on the even-numbered pages." "Huh, no way," Mbeke says. "You read Rilke?" "Nice," BC says. "That might work, but you know what they'll say. Not good enough," he says in a mock Arabian accent. "You know they won't allow the Arabic on the odd pages," he notes. "They'll have to be on the left." "But don't you see, Mbeke? If you can get them arguing about which side the translation goes on, you're already on the road to victory." "Do you really think so?" Mbeke challenges him. "Sure," BC says with enthusiasm. "Then you can start arguing over what goes in." "They want the whole Quran in the book," Mbeke says in exasperation. "Put it all in then," BC says matter-of-factly, a little impatient. "Do we need alternate translations for the Bible section too?" "Well, no," Mbeke answers. "Good. Why does this seem so obvious to me?" "You are not an unreasonable diehard, BC. We're dealing with dogmatists on both sides, and we have to. Because if they're not behind this, nothing will happen. Nothing will really change." "And how many on our side want to include the entire Bible?" "Well, there are a few. Most of them. All of them, actually," he mumbles. "Great," BC says sarcastically, throwing his arms up in exasperation. "So our old guard is just as bad as theirs." "Sometimes worse. We have a fundamentalist among our negotiators. He's NCC but still fundy. And he gets the others all rallying around him." "I knew I should have declared fundamentalism a heresy when I was Pope," BC sighs. "Wish it was so easy. The NCC is a tolerant church, BC," Mbeke mock lectures him. "The fundies are still not sure they should be part of a church led by an openly gay Pope, BC, so I try not to provoke them." "That's an issue?" "It is with them." "Should have excommunicated them," BC says. "I should have, I mean." "So," Mbeke says, "what would you include or exclude from the Book of Unity, from the Bible? You do know the book I mean, right? Ever read it?" "Mbeke, I was the Pope," BC protests. "Right. I've known religious leaders with only a passing knowledge of the Bible," Mbeke says. "Point taken." "Well," Mbeke presses. "Well, what?" BC asks. "What parts of the Bible should be included?" "You really want to know?" "Have you ever really thought about this, BC?" "I have, but you won't like it." "Probably not," Mbeke concedes. "But go ahead." "Well, for starters, I'm not really sure we need the Old Testament." "Let's see what he thinks of that." "BC, I thought you wanted this book to reflect the Jews, too." "Okay, maybe we keep Genesis and Exodus. Maybe just Genesis." "You can't leave out Moses. You've got to have Exodus," Mbeke says. "Okay, then. Those two. Some of the Psalms, the ones that aren't too tribal and bloodthirsty. Job is good. We can keep the book of Job in there. Joshua? Judges? Nah, BC says, dismissing them. Bloody tribal warfare dressed up as God's will. Bad behavior sanctioned by a bloody tribal god. Don't need all the rules in Leviticus either. There I won't argue, Mbeke says. Chronicles, Kings? No and no. Proverbs? Song of Songs? Some of the Proverbs, BC says, thinking out loud. Don't think we need Song of Songs. It's like ancient porno. BC, Mbeke exclaims. It is a good thing you didn't let people know you felt this way while you were Pope. I wasn't a very popey Pope, BC says. That is true, Mbeke agrees. Ecclesiastes? What, vanity, vanity, all is vanity, that guy? That's the one. I kind of like that one, BC admits. What about the prophets? Jeremiah's okay. You know the fundies will demand that we include Daniel, but I don't see it. None of the later prophets or history books, really, either. Nor Ezra? Nah. None of the Old Testament Apocrypha? They're not even really part of the Old Testament anyway. Leave them out. Man, BC, you're a ruthless editor. I almost hate to ask about the New Testament. You really want to know? The New Testament? Well, I guess the Gospels are okay, but add Thomas's too. Uh-oh, here we go, Mbeke says. Drop Revelation entirely, no reason for it. But wasn't written by John the Apostle. It's really about Nero and the Roman Empire. Doesn't even mention the Antichrist. Just doesn't belong in the Bible or the Book of Unity. That'll go over big with the fundies. They agreed to the consolidation in the NCC, didn't they? They did, but we have gradings, degrees, and they like that, having the ability to be a part of things and yet still maintain their own way of celebrating their beliefs. Even when those beliefs create us versus them mentalities? Why keep books in the Bible that breed hatred? BC asks. Are you on our side? Mbeke asks. Or the Muslims? BC frowns and doesn't answer. Sorry, Mbeke says. You've actually been very helpful. Some of your suggestions have merit. I think the idea of Arabic on one page, English on the other, will work with them. Mbeke changes the subject. Will you be staying in Vatican City for any services? He asks BC. Hold on, he says, and checks his calendar. I will. I'll have to leave after the early mass tomorrow. I promised the Brain Trust out in the asteroids that I'd be there soon. They're promising a grand unveiling of some new systems. Reverse engineered from the Eldred technology? Yeah, they made some breakthroughs recently. I haven't been able to see much. They've been quietly holed up with the ship, figuring it all out and coming up with only God knows what. Well, at least the Eldred have given us some breathing room, and Dolomay has been quiet too, Mbeke says. They've both been too quiet, you know? The Eldred are out there, but they don't talk to us now. There have been rumors from the Domo and the Flays that Dolomay is again attacking isolated outposts, but nothing solid. They could be old reports resurfacing. It's hard to know what's going on. The Eldred could be massing forces from across the stars. We have no idea how far their dominion reaches. Part of me dreads the thought that they're gathering ships for a comprehensive final assault on humanity. We don't know where Dolomay is nursing his wounds, but we know he'll be back when he's back up to fighting strength. We know there's more coming, but we don't know when. What was that thing, when you've got that sword hanging over your head? BC asks him. Damocles, Mbeke tells him. The sword of Damocles. Waiting for it to fall, huh? Pretty much, BC admits. But the project gives me hope. If we can counter the Eldred's current weaponry, we're on our way to beating them. Mbeke looks at him quizzically. The Eldred are a static, unimaginative race, BC explains. If we can block their current technology, they'll be hard-pressed to come up with new ways of attacking us. I hope you're right, Mbeke says. Me too, BC admits. BC and Mbeke end their meeting, and BC retires to the quarters provided for him in the Vatican. His comm is flashing, full of queued-up messages. Anita called with an update. Wentworth wants a word. There's also a draft report on independent orbital platforms. BC decides to read the report first. He had UTZ operatives assess the status of the orbital stations that hadn't joined the UTZ alliance. He wanted to see if any other stations might become allies, or offer assistance. I think we need a new name for our alliance. UTZ doesn't fit anymore. When we ask these old independents to join with us, what do we tell them they're joining? How many stations are still operating? Some stations are dead, wiped out by the plague, or simply abandoned as crews became scarce. Others are run by rugged individualists who just want to be left alone. 3 once thriving stations were wiped out in raids by Dolomay in the last year. This leaves a short list of indie stations. All of them are dependent on UTZ currency and trade, but none want to be beholden to the UTZ. BC has been developing a plan to bring them into the fold, beginning by changing the name of the currency. The status report gets him thinking. "Com," BC calls out. A unit appears on the desktop. "Get me the Caliph, please," BC says. In a minute or so, the Caliph is on the line. "Greetings and respect, my friend," the Caliph says. "Greetings and salutations," BC responds. "To what do I owe the pleasure of your company?" the Caliph asks. "I noticed when I was with you on Mars 2 weeks ago that you didn't seem to want to talk about the Book of Unity." BC gets right to the point. "Thought maybe we hit a breakdown in the negotiations. I've just met with the Pope. I've suggested some ways to accommodate your needs for the Book of Unity." "Really?" the Caliph says, with a hint of surprise. "Really? Could your people accept the Quran included both in Arabic and in a second language?" BC asks. "So, it would be there in the proper tongue, and also in translation?" BC nods. "That might work," the Caliph says. "It might." "Thank you," BC says. "I also wanted to talk more about our currency ideas. I think I'm going to consolidate the UTZ and UIN currencies as alliance dollars." "If you change the name of the currency, will you then go ahead with a further name change? Will you change the name of the UTZ, too?" the Caliph asks him cautiously. "Doesn't really seem to fit anymore, does it?" "No, but I do not think it would surprise anyone that I do not like the name." The Caliph laughs a quick laugh. "Do you dare, though? What will you call it? The Alliance?" "The Alliance? I don't know. I don't know if the UTZ Council is ready for a new name, so no, not yet. But we have to call the combined currency something. Alliance dollars has a good ring to it. I think it will get any holdouts to sign on with us once they see we aren't forcing them to become UTZ." "I see. Well, do as you must. On these political issues, I find I usually agree with you. You have been incredibly honest with me, with us so far," the Caliph says. "So, no new name for anything yet?" "Not yet, Caliph. You're the only one I've even discussed this with so far. Nope, no new name. And no Book of Unity." "Well, I am sorry about the book, but that you would discuss this idea of the alliance with me, for that I am honored." "You don't have an ego stake invested in the old names. It's refreshing. There are many in the UTZ and the UIN who do." "Ego stake?" The Caliph notes the term. "I like that. And you, Campion, have very little ego stake, do you?" "I do, or I don't, I guess," BC says. "I just want to see us survive," he says. "Yes," the Caliph says. "I have recognized this about you. You really are trying to keep us all alive. How ironic is that for a former assassin?" "Old news," BC says. "Even then I was only trying to do what was right." "It is funny how that changes, is it not?" the Caliph observes. "Sure," BC says cautiously. "But I think it all has to do with who we call us and who we call them, doesn't it?" "Go on," the Caliph encourages. "Well, I now define us as the human race," BC says. "It's a broader definition than I used to have." "True, but accurate. So who becomes your them?" the Caliph asks him. "The Eldred, Dolomay, whoever threatens us, I guess." "That makes a certain amount of sense. You know, though, eventually even those them could and should one day become us," the Caliph muses. "That's pretty progressive of you, Caliph, seeing as how they've been trying to wipe you out." "Thank you. This is a new time for Islam. We are trying to figure out just what submission to the will of Allah really means," the Caliph says. Would it be wrong for me to suggest you're kind of enlightened, Caliph?" The Caliph begins laughing. "Wrong? I guess we shall find out." "So then, you're okay if I change the name, starting with the currency?" "I am. Go ahead," the Caliph says. "Thank you, Caliph," BC says. "What? The Solar Alliance?" the Caliph asks. "Something like that," BC admits. "It shouldn't be named for any one planet of people," he explains. "Name it for the sun. That makes sense." "Thanks," BC says. "I must admit, you are still not what I expected." "No? Is that good?" "It has been great," the Caliph assures him. "You are a continuing revelation to me. You do Allah's work without knowing it. You are like a demon
unknowingly moving as Allah wills. So that's how you see me, huh? A force for Allah whether I like it or not. Pretty much. You do not stand in God's way. That's about as good as we can hope for from a Christian. You do not subordinate yourself to the will of Allah, but you do not actively thwart his will either. Thanks, I think, BC replies. Do you suppose the human race is actually worth saving? The Caliph begins laughing out loud. What? BC asks. Again, you ask the inconvenient question. Even in the midst of doing all you can to save us all, you aren't afraid to ask the hard questions. Don't you ever question yourself? BC asks him. I question whether or not my ego gets in the way of my submission to Allah, the Caliph explains. My questions are, well, deep. I'd like to... Again the Caliph laughs. Have you ever read Rumi? Rumi? No, I have no idea. He was a whirling dervish, a charismatic follower of Islam and of Allah. The Caliph pauses to smile. We would all be better off knowing more Rumi. He was a great poet, you see. He writes of knocking on the door to madness, only to have it opened to find out he was on the other side. Has the door been opened? BC asks. I believe it has, the Caliph says. But it remains to be seen which side of the door we end up on, does it not? Indeed, BC agrees. Thank you, Caliph. Campion out. BC signs off. Shuts off the comm.
That was part 1 of Chapter 14 of Vatican Abdicator on Glow-in-the-Dark Radio. Well, the Unified Holy Book may not be going well, but BC seems to have a good rapport with both Mbeke and the new Caliph. Even the idea of Alliance dollars seems to have been received pretty well. And maybe even the idea of becoming the Solar Alliance. We shall see. But now BC has to talk with Wentworth of the UTZ next. So, a bit of a hurdle there, perhaps. But we'll pick things up there as BC gets in touch with Wentworth in part 2 of Chapter 14 of Vatican Abdicator, coming up on our next episode of Glow-in-the-Dark Radio. Again, I want to thank my patrons who help keep this whole thing going, and encourage you to become a patron if you like what you're hearing. For $2 a month, $5 a month, or $10 a month, you can help support Glow-in-the-Dark Radio by going to patreon.com/glow-in-the-dark-radio and signing up. Also the place to go if you want to learn more, or just go to my sites and follow the links to Patreon. And a reminder, you can get the free Vatican Assassin 15th Anniversary Edition audiobook at many different online outlets, except for Audible. Pretty much every place else is giving away my Vatican Assassin 15th Anniversary Edition audiobook with all the cool cameos, the voice cameos. More details in the show notes. There's a link to my site at glowinthedarkradio.com. And that is all for this week. I'm your host, your writer and reader, Mike Luoma. Thank you again for listening to Glow in the Dark Radio. Glow in the Dark Radio. This podcast presentation is copyright 2023 by Michael F. Luoma and is protected under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License, CC by NCND 4.0. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can find his work at incompetech.com. Mike's books are available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook, wherever you find books online. Get links and more details at glowinthedarkradio.com and MikeLuoma.com. This has been a presentation of Glow in the Dark Radio.